Madam President, I rise today on behalf of the 74 fallen Vietnam veterans our government has forgotten, known as the Lost 74. On June 3rd of 1969, the USS Frank E. Evans was participating in a training mission 100 miles from the Vietnam War combat zone, having been sent there in between combat missions, that is to say, neither coming nor going. During the night, the ship collided with an Allied aircraft carrier and sank, killing 74 sailors. Remembering, this is just outside the combat zone, between combat missions. These 74 are Vietnam veterans who died in service to our country. The ship had served on several combat tours and had many more scheduled. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial on the National Mall here in Washington, D.C. memorializes over 58,000 military members who paid the ultimate sacrifice during the Vietnam War by displaying their names on its wall. People from around the world come to see the memorial and pay their respects to those who fought and died for the freedoms that we all hold dear. Yet, because of a technicality, the names of the lost 74 sailors are excluded from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. As requirements now stand, veterans must have perished in or on their way to a combat zone. Since the Frank E. Evans was participating in a practice exercise in between stints in fighting off the Vietnam coast, the names of these sailors have been left off of the wall. Imagine that, Madam President. These sailors deployed overseas in the service of our nation. They left their homes, their families, their friends, their loved ones on behalf of our nation. They paid the ultimate sacrifice like every other man and woman who was lost, yet their names have been left off the iconic memorial constructed in their honor. As a parent, I can't imagine the pain that some of these families must have felt. I first learned of this injustice during a talk radio town hall in 2018, when a family member of Fargo resident and Frank E. Evans survivor Dick Grant called into the program. After hearing his story, I learned about one of his shipmates, Robert Cyril, a fellow North Dakotan from Grand Forks, who was also on board the ship and perished in the accident. Robert enlisted in the Navy Reserves in 1967 and reported to the Frank E. Evans in May of 1968. Later that year, he married his wife, Thelma. Robert was on watch in the forward fire room with 3 other men when the collision occurred. All 4 were killed. His twin sons were just 4 months old. Madam President, North Dakota paid a great price when the USS Frank E. Evans sunk, yet my state does not grieve alone. The lost 74 encompass sailors from 29 different states, and the bill before us today represents that diversity spanning the political aisle. Before I ask for a unanimous consent, I'd like to yield some time to the distinguished gentleman from New York, the Democratic leader.
Mr. President,
the Democratic
Madam
leader.
President, and I'll be brief because I know my colleagues wish to join in this wonderful activity here to try and get good recognition. I join my colleague from North Dakota in strong support of a cause near and dear to my heart, the effort to add the names of the 74 sailors to the Vietnam War Memorial who perished in the training accident that sunk the USS Frank E. Evans in June of 1969. As my friend from North Dakota explained, the names of the 74 who died on the USS Frank Evans have been omitted because they died just outside the combat zone. But they had seen the heat of battle in Vietnam. The USS Frank Evans had been part of the Tet Offensive and was scheduled to return to the combat zone before sinking. That these men's lives ended in the tragedy of a training accident rather than in the line of fire makes no difference in the final analysis. They went off to war and laid down their lives in service of the country they loved. I was fortunate to know Larry Riley Sr. of Syracuse, New York, known to us as Chief Riley, who was serving on the Frank Evans alongside his son, Larry Riley Jr., on that fateful day in 1969. Larry Sr. survived that day. Jr. did not. And for the rest of his life, Chief Riley petitioned his country to give his son and his fellow shipmates the very least it could give to them, due recognition. I sat in Chief Riley's living room, and I've sat on Mary Ann Buettner's back porch and listened to her tell me all about her son, Terry Lee Henderson, who had also seen combat in Vietnam and who also died in that awful accident. Chief Riley passed away 2 years ago this month, but his cause does not die with him. These were living, breathing boys who lost their lives wearing the uniform of this great country. To inscribe their names on a memorial is but a small measure of peace for the families they left behind, the rightful act of a nation that recognizes the sacrifices of all its sons. I yield to my colleague from New Hampshire.
Thank you, Madam President.
The senator from New Hampshire.
I'm here to add my voice to the eloquence of both Senators Cramer and Senator Schumer about the need to recognize those people who were lost on the Frank Evans. We had 2 sailors from New Hampshire who were lost that day. Ronald Arthur Thibodeau of Manchester, New Hampshire, joined the Navy in 1967, and he was assigned to the Frank E. Evans as radar man. Ron was on watch during the collision, and he was lost at sea, leaving behind a young son. And Gary Joseph Vigue of Farmington, New Hampshire, was also on watch that night during the fatal collision. Gary had married his high school sweetheart a few weeks before he reported to the Frank Evans in 1968. Gary also left behind a young son and his 2 brothers who still live in New Hampshire. These 2 men, Gary and Ron, gave their lives for this country. These men were supporting operations during the Vietnam War, and they were planning to return to Vietnam waters once the training exercise was over. So just like all those other people who were lost in Vietnam, they gave their lives for this country. And just because they were outside some artificially designated combat zone doesn't mean they shouldn't be recognized in the same way that the others who were lost in Vietnam have been recognized. You know, Madam President, this is May, the month of May. Memorial Day is approaching, a day during which our nation honors the men and women who have died while serving in the U.S. military. And as we recognize the sacrifices of our fellow Americans, I think it's appropriate that the Senate take up and pass the USS Frank E. Evans Act, legislation that I'm really honored to co-sponsor with my colleague, Senator Cramer from North Dakota, because it's legislation that will ensure the 74 men, those lost 74, are rightfully honored by adding their names to the Vietnam War Memorial. I urge my colleagues to support this measure. Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Senator Cramer, for this effort to ensure that the lost 74 are recognized.
Madam President.
Senator from North Dakota.
Madam President, whether North Dakotans, Granite Staters, or New Yorkers, these stories are very moving. And when I first heard from Mr. Grant's family, I was a member of the House of Representatives. And I looked into his request and introduced an amendment to the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act to inscribe the names of the lost 74. While the measure unanimously passed the House, it was blocked here in the Senate. So when I came to the Senate last year, introducing this legislation was one of my very first actions and high priorities. And it had some success. We have 20 co-sponsors, 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats, including the chairman and the ranking Democrat on the subcommittee that has jurisdiction. When members from Montana to Maine, North Dakota to New Hampshire, and New York can come together on an issue as important as honoring the fallen sailors, I would hope this would garner some attention, and it has. It has. Last summer, the Frank E. Evans Act received its first ever hearing before a Senate Energy Subcommittee. I thank the chairman and my colleague from Alaska for providing the opportunity for the story of these sailors to be heard. It was there when I first heard opposition to the bill, however. Madam President, I've yet to hear any real opposition to the legislation voiced by anyone except the bureaucrats and special interests who would actually have to be charged with carrying it out. In other words, nobody objects to this except the people that would have to do something about it. And that's a common theme in this town, I've noticed. For example, the acting director of the National Park Service said of the bill, if passed, now imagine this is a quote, if passed, it would necessitate substantial modification of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Wall as it exists today. No kidding. Of course it does. That's the point of the bill. The idea that we should continue to turn a blind eye to forgotten veterans because the work would be substantial is offensive. It's certainly offensive to the shipmates and the families and the survivors of the last 74. So forgive my lack of sympathy for bureaucrats who feel inconvenienced by the death of 74 war heroes. The country that landed a man on the moon the very same year that this accident happened certainly can figure out how to fix a wall to honor these war dead. More to the point, Madam President, shouldn't we be looking for more ways to honor our fallen rather than fewer? The opposition's argument simply does not add up. Since the wall was built, hundreds of names have been added, and more work still needs to be done. According to the Washington Post, one soldier was etched 3 times. 13 soldiers had their name etched twice. And while the wall bears 58,390 names, they represent 58,276 different people. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, which is responsible for the wall, conducted a study which showed flaws exist with names etched in the memorial. To think we'd not add the names of the last 74 when we know corrections already need to be made seems counterintuitive, if not downright lazy. Yet despite all this, despite the veterans being forgotten, despite this legislation being sent here twice by the House, despite a successful hearing on the bill, progress in the Senate has stalled. And that's why, Madam President, my colleagues and I have asked the Department of Defense to address this issue as well. The department has a mixed, if not negative, record with this issue. You know, they tell you what you want to hear till you go away and hope you never come back. Yet, similar to this body, we've been met with complete silence. Not a yes, not a no, not a maybe, not a suggestion to make the proposal better. We find their silence unacceptable. Therefore, I'm going to ask for unanimous consent to pass the Frank E. Evans Act. The last 74, their loved ones and their shipmates have waited long enough. No matter how it can be spun, the choice before this chamber is whether to give these veterans the recognition they deserve or to stand in their way. So, Madam President, with that, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Energy be discharged from further consideration of S-849 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I ask unanimous consent that the bill be considered read a 3rd time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there objection?
Madam President.
The senator from Alaska.
Madam President, reserving the right to object. Madam President, I have the honor to serve as the chairman of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, which does have jurisdiction over S-849, the USS Frank E. Evans Act. But in that capacity as chairman, I now have the unenviable position of having to rise to register an objection at this moment. And I want it to be clear to my colleague from North Dakota, from my colleague from New Hampshire, my colleague from New York, and all those for whom this is a measure that they are seeking this legislative endorsement, know that I have the absolute highest regard for the men and the women who serve our country, the sacrifices that they have made for all of us. As the senator from New Hampshire just mentioned, as we approach Memorial Day, I think what we seek to do is to try to find ways to honor more of those who have served our great nation, and a recognition that those who lost their lives on the Frank E. Evans deserve a form of recognition, a recognition as all those who lost their lives in Vietnam. The story that has been relayed by colleagues here of the USS Frank E. Evans is truly one of the most tragic that occurred during the Vietnam War. I am absolutely sympathetic, have had these discussions with my colleague, Senator Cramer. I appreciate the efforts that he is making now and that he has made prior to his time here in the Senate to recognize these sailors who gave their lives in the incident. The reality that we face in the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, again, we're the committee of jurisdiction as we have the oversight of the National Park Service, but it is not the National Park Service that determines what or who is eligible for inscription on the wall. It is the Department of the Defense that is responsible for determining whether service members' names are eligible for inscription. And this is based on very specific criteria that is set not by those of us here in Congress, not by those of us in the Energy Committee. It is set specifically by the Department of Defense. And as has been raised here on the floor, the criteria do not allow or accommodate the timing. The Evans sailors do not meet the eligibility criteria that DOD has set out because it was not in the defined combat zone of Vietnam at the time of the 1969 mishap. And I would agree with my colleagues. It is indeed unfortunate that we have this designation, this eligibility criteria that has left the honor that is due these sailors, left it open and unaddressed. And so it is unfortunate that we are here today and that I stand in a position left to object despite the efforts that not only my staff on the Energy and Natural Resources Committee and I have made to work with Senator Cramer, work with his team, work with DOD to find an approach that we should all be able to agree on to memorialize these sailors. So as we're looking for that path, I do stand to object to discharging this bill from the committee, but I will make this commitment. This is a matter that must be addressed, is long overdue. We will find a way to honor these sailors, but at this juncture, there remain practical, legal, and technical considerations that we have to resolve with the text with regards to the effort that my colleague from North Dakota is offering today. So at this time, I reluctantly will note my objection.
Objection is heard.
Mr. President,
The Senator for North Dakota.
if I just might address a couple of things. First of all, we're here to change legal objections. That's why we're the legislative branch. We're the policymaking branch. The Department of Defense, as much respect as I have for them and particularly for the Secretary, they work for us. We don't work for them. So I appreciate the commitment of the chairman. I look forward to working with her and the committee on getting to a markup and passing the legislation so that we don't have to submit ourselves to the bureaucracy, but rather get the things turned around where the bureaucracy begins to submit itself to the legislative branch. With that, again, I thank the President. I thank my colleagues from New York and New Hampshire, and certainly the chairwoman of Energy Committee, and look forward to working on a resolution soon. I yield the floor. Note the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.